Hello, my name is Dennis, and welcome to my trailer park white trash mobile home kitchen. I really do live in a mobile home, in a trailer park, and this is my kitchen. One of the fans of the website suggested I come up with a video on how to sharpen knives. I want to preface this by saying this is not the only way to sharpen knives. This is what works for me. So if you have a better way, feel free to use it. I'm going to talk to you about what works for me and how to maintain mostly the sharpening edge, the sharp edge on a chef's knife, because that's your workhorse knife. That's the knife you use most in the kitchen. This is a 9-inch chef's knife. This I maintain very well. The trick with a chef's knife is every bit of this cutting edge has to come into contact with the cutting board. If I use something like the handle of my spider web strainer, if you hold the knife against the handle of something straight like this and just watch the edge as you bring the knife all the way down against the handle, every millimeter of that cutting edge from the tip of the knife to the heel of the blade should come into contact with the cutting edge. This is a chopping knife. You want this entire knife to come into contact with the board, your chopping board, because otherwise if you have a big gap in there, you're not going to be able to cut down through something. So that's what's important about maintaining the edge of a chef's knife. Now, how do you do that? Where a lot of people, I think, go wrong is they use those electric sharpening wheels. It's a kind of a long plastic box with 4 grooves in it. I'll explain the meaning of the grooves in a moment, but you draw the knife through the grooves a few times on this one, and then you draw the knife through the grooves a few times, the other 2 grooves. The problem is if you have a knife with a bolster on it and a thick heel, you're not going to get this heel to go through the slot. It's too wide. So you end up sharpening it from about here forward. Every time you sharpen it, you take metal off from here forward. This area here doesn't get honed down, and therefore after a while your knife's going to get that curve in it that's going to make it not work as a chopping knife. So what I do is I'll show you how I sharpen my knives, but I also every once in a while I'll maintain this heel by using a Dremel tool to grind a little bit of metal off of this heel to keep it down a little bit so that I can maintain the curvature of my blade. All right, now let's next talk about the geometry of this actual cutting edge of the blade. If you were to cut, say, through the knife and then look very, very closely using a high-powered microscope and look at the actual cutting edge of the knife has, I call it, 2 angles to it. This is the geometry of the blade. The first one I call the taper. That taper is the wedge that when you're cutting down through a tomato or an onion, it peels that slice off, and then you do your next slice. That's the taper, right? Then along the very edge, there's a different angle that I call the bevel. The reason why you have 2 is because you have to maintain the knife so that it lasts a long time. I'm going to use an illustration. I've drawn up a couple of illustrations here. Imagine if, I don't know how well you can see this, imagine if you just maintained the knife using this long pointed taper. Okay, that would be a nice cutting edge right there, very sharp. You could shave with that. But the problem is the metal is so thin that if you hit it against a bone, you hit it against a carving fork, you hit it the wrong way against your carving board, your cutting board, the metal could chip. It's too thin. It's too fragile. Another thing it'll do is it'll curve down over time. That's why those chefs, when they have those sharpening steels and you see a chef, he's using a sharpening steel to sharpen his knife. What he's doing is he's just maintaining that top edge to keep the curls out of it and to keep it sharp. A steel is a good way to maintain the edge, but in the long run, you're going to have to occasionally resharpen the knife in order to maintain the geometry of that cutting point. So, again, this is the taper, but this point here would be too thin. It would chip easily. It would bend over. Your knife in a very short time wouldn't be very usable because of this point. So, what sharpeners do is they also maintain this point by blunting it a little bit. Okay, this I call the bevel. This part right here, it's at a slightly different angle. the metal is so thick here at this point that it's going to maintain its shape a lot longer. It won't get dinged, it won't get bent. This bevel is so tiny on the cutting edge that you can barely see it with the naked eye. So don't expect to see a really large bevel. Again, this is highly magnified. This taper is about a 15-degree off from the center line of the blade, and then the bevel is about 30 degrees off. This won't ding, this won't bend over. Typically what you do is you maintain this bevel every time you sharpen your knife, and then every 5 or 6 times you sharpen your knife, you work on restoring that taper, and then you go back to maintaining this bevel. That's why those electric rotary cutters you see have 2 sets of slots. In the first set, there's these diamond wheels in there, and they're about 15 degrees off, and as you draw your knife through the first set of slots, each of those diamond wheels will maintain the taper. Then you use the second set of slots where the wheels are at a slightly wider angle, and that maintains that bevel of the knife. To sharpen my knives, I use a diamond hone. This is a steel hone. It's mostly steel, and these are typically made with a rather thick coating of nickel on the surface of the hone, and in that nickel is impregnated the small diamond particles. The idea being that the nickel is soft, and as you work with your knife, you're slowly over time going to wear that nickel down, and that's going to expose more and more of the diamond chips that you're going to be using to actually sharpen the knife. I like a diamond hone. They take off a lot of metal. They sharpen a knife very quickly. There are whetstones, oil stones. There are other sharpening implements you can use. I prefer to work with a diamond hone. This one has rubber feet on it, which is kind of nice because I don't have to use any kind of a pad. Now, I talked about the 2 angles. I'm actually going to sharpen this knife because as I look at this, I can see there's a couple of shiny spots on there. There's some dings. So I'm going to sharpen this knife. The way I do this is I start at a low angle to maintain the cutting edge, the taper rather. The low angle, which is about 15 degrees up. And just by working in a circular motion against the diamonds, that will maintain that taper. Again, I don't do the taper too often. Let me look at this. Okay, I'm seeing a little bit of ding here. This one's a little bit there. I've already got most of those dings taken out. This knife hasn't been sharpened in a few weeks, so I'm expecting it to have some dings in it over time. Just one here, and that'll probably disappear when I maintain that bevel edge. Okay, so there's the taper. The next step is to tilt the knife up a little bit more to maintain the bevel. Now, there's different ways of maintaining the bevel, and it depends upon how you like your knife. This is purely a matter of preference. The most general way of maintaining the bevel is, again, with a circular motion, the knife blade up a little bit more at about a 30-degree angle, and using a circular motion will give you kind of a general cutting edge. If you were to look at that cutting edge under a very high-powered microscope, such as an electron microscope, you would see some jagged edge on there. It would look like a serrated knife. That's actually good, because that's the serrated edge is what's going to cut through fibers. It's what's going to cut through the skin of an onion, the skin of a tomato. Another way to do this is to just use long strokes with your knife this way. And what that will do is that'll give you a very smooth, polished edge. If you're going to be cutting a lot of fiber, then the other way to do this is to work against the cutting edge this way at your 30-degree angle. And what this does is it gives you a very microscopic jagged edge. So again, if you looked at that under a very high-powered electron microscope, there would actually be teeth on there. Those teeth are very effective when cutting through fibrous meat, when cutting through celery. your preference. It's up to you how you want to maintain that cutting edge, that bevel, whether you want it to have jagged teeth, whether you want a general purpose cutting edge, or whether you want a very smooth cutting edge. It depends on how you want to cut your food. The last thing I want to talk about is how to store your knives so as to protect them. Don't just toss your knives into a knife drawer. Why would you want to dull the edge by it coming into contact with other knives in the drawer after you've gone through all the work of sharpening that edge or paying someone to sharpen the edge? Protect your knives by storing them properly. I store mine in a knife block, and when I put my knives in the knife block, I actually slide it in with the heel, the spine of the knife rather, down, and the cutting edge up, so that it slides into the knife block without the cutting edge scraping against the wood. I don't know that it's all that necessary, but that's how I store my knives, in a knife block. Another thing that I do when I travel with my knives, I'm rather good with my hands, so I made my own leather sheaths with some leather that I bought. This is my leather sheath for my 9-inch chef's knife. I have my 8-inch chef knife in its own sheath. I have a sheath that I made for my boning knife. And then finally, I have one of these long carving knives for carving a roast. You really have to see this blade to appreciate it. This is a long, thin blade for carving through a roast. I made a sheath for it as well. So my knives have their own leather sheath. When I'm traveling, I take this with me to keep my knives safe. It's also like if I'm in a cooking class, it's a way of storing my knife in the pocket of my apron without having to worry about being cut with that bare knife just sitting. Imagine that sitting inside of my apron. By keeping it in its sheath, I can store it in my apron. I don't have to worry about other students picking it up and chopping with it and using it the wrong way and them possibly damaging. So that's how I protect my knives when I'm traveling, and then I use my knife block whenever I'm storing my knife in my own kitchen. So hopefully you found this video helpful on maintaining the cutting edge of your knives. If you're not comfortable with sharpening your own knives, take them to a sharpener that you can trust to maintain especially the cutting edge, the curvature of that chef's knife. If you take anything away from this video at all, what I would like you to hold on to is how to properly store your knives. Because why spend money or time sharpening the knives if you're not going to sharpen them, if you're not going to store them properly, rather? A good, sharp kitchen knife is one of the most essential, if not the most essential tool in a practical kitchen. So again, I hope this video has helped you to maintain your knives.